welcome to the Taste Talks. Today we have Lydia Burns, our favorite cheesemonger, of course, who is going to be showing us a dish that I have not had myself. I'm not familiar with. I'm very excited to learn about this. Let me see if I got the pronunciation right. Käsespätzle.
Almost.
One day I'll get it. So yeah. It is a German dish featuring cheese, of course, and spätzle. And she is going to let us know how to do it. And I do have the recipe to share with you also. I will be sharing that via email tomorrow. If you're not on our email list, please email taste@nl.edu and we can get you any of the information you need. So please, Lydia, go right ahead.
So in the Alps, people often associate cheese with the cuisine because it's the main feature when we think of fondue or raclette, some of the other dishes that we've made. One of I'd say the lesser known ones, when we talk about the Alps, we often think of Switzerland, France, and we don't always talk about Germany or Austria, but a large part of the Alps is in both Germany and Austria. And it has the same cheese making tradition as the rest of the Alps. So they make mountain cheeses, or in German and Austrian, what they refer to as Bergkäse, Berg meaning mountain, Käse being the word for cheese. And then they also additionally make cheeses on the high altitude peaks in the summer months. And those are a special designation of cheese, just like they are in Switzerland and in Italy. And those are called Alpkäse, meaning they have to be made at a certain altitude on the top of the mountains in the summers. And these cheeses really just are the localized version of cheeses like Gruyere or Comté or other Alpine cheeses you might be more familiar with the names of, because the Swiss are really good at marketing and so are the French. And so we know a lot more about those cheeses here. But in the German Alps and Austrian Alps, which is just on the other side of Lake Constance from Switzerland. So it's really, you don't feel the borders when you're in the Alps. It's one unified region, and they just, they happen to speak different dialects or different languages depending on how far afield you go. But the cheese culture and the cuisine is really unified, but there are some particularities to the different countries. And one of those dishes is Käsespätzle, and I love it. I think German and Austrian food sometimes gets a bad rep in general, but Alpine German and Austrian food is really delicious and awesome because it's made using delicious high quality cheese and dairy. And it's really simple. It tends to be hearty, more farmer or peasant food. And I think most Americans identify with this style of food. So essentially the Käsespätzle is the German Alpine version of mac and cheese. So spätzle is a little dumpling. And well, I'm gonna show you how to make that. That's the majority of the recipe. And then you layer that with cheese, and you can either just toss it warm and serve it as is and then sprinkle some caramelized onions on top. Or you can, if you like it really brown and bubbly, you can additionally bake it for 5 to 10 minutes so it gets that little like golden coating, dries out a little bit, and gets that like crispy cheese top. And then you'd still garnish with the onions. But that's essentially the dish. The trick is really in the spätzle. And if you've ever had spätzle at a restaurant here, or maybe you've bought it in some of the grocery stores here that have like a nice ethnic aisle, it's kind of different. I've bought a lot of different bags of it. The one thing that I do notice is always the same is there's a bright yellow color. And part of that is because it is an egg-based noodle, but additionally, the type of flour you use is specific to sometimes even the region, but in the Alps, they have a special blend, which you can't really get here. So I recommend as an alternative, you take a mixture of regular flour or 00 Italian flour. If you have it, is perfect. But if not, regular flour totally works. And then you also add a fine grained semolina to that. It's mostly flour, but you do need that semolina for that heartiness, that different texture. It really does make a difference. And that's also partially what lends the noodle its color. So we're gonna start making it. There's a couple alternatives because there is a specialized piece of equipment that unless you're German, you probably don't have or been to the Alps. So there are some variations, or you could get creative, and I'll mention those when we get there. But mostly just, hazard. We're mostly just starting with eggs, and I've already whipped this. So this is just 2, I'm having the recipe calls for 4 eggs, but because I'm one person, I'm gonna half this. I'm gonna add an extra egg since I lost some. But so essentially with this, you just whisk the eggs until they get nice and frothy. And this is just the eggs, nothing else is added yet. And so definitely a key to making these right, because the dough can be kind of hard to work with, is that you really do have to get a lot of air into it. So first, starting with the eggs, you want to make sure you really get them nice and frothy so they hold those bubbles, like tiny little bubbles. Then after you've got it really nice and frothy, I find it's best to get rid of the whisk at this point, because again, I mentioned the dough is really sticky and it just kind of gets stuck to the whisk, and it can be really hard to work it off. So I usually switch to a wooden spoon at this point, good old wooden spoon. And then you're gonna add the flour mixture, which is again, that blend of semolina and regular flour. And then there's also a half teaspoon of salt and some freshly ground nutmeg, which you can do to your taste. It doesn't really matter. I really like it, so I usually go a little heavier on it. So, you just have a little plain, you can get these whole nutmeg. Use these in a lot in Alpine cuisine. Usually fondue is traditionally topped with this, and sometimes raclette as well. And with this, you're just gonna keep mixing the flour in. And like I said, this will get pretty sticky. And then depending on what implement you're gonna use, if you have a Spätzle, this is a specialized piece of equipment. It essentially looks like a grater, but you put the dough in here, you'll see it in action in a minute. And so it grates it into the boiling water and it creates these little dumplings. But if you don't have that, a lot of people push the dough through a colander, which also works really well. And if you're doing that method, then you're gonna wanna do it to the same consistency you'd use if you're using the Spätzle. But the other thing you can do, which is really laborious, but if you like to do the more labor inducive method, then you get a board and you'll make the dough a thinner consistency, and you cut it with a knife on a board and scoop it into the water as you do it. Mm-hmm. That's why sometimes if you've had Spätzle, you'll notice there's different shapes. Sometimes they're like little dumplings, which are the ones I make with the Spätzle, and sometimes they're like a longer, more like rough noodle. And so obviously those are the hand cut ones. It's just again, it varies by region. The doughs are usually similar. It's just a matter of how they form. So when you mix all of this together, the dough is pretty dry. So you have to add a little bit of water, and this is where it's going to vary how much you use. I like to use sparkling water. I find it kind of helps a little more. It's not necessary. You can use regular water if you don't have it, but I just find it helps. So I just add a little bit, because essentially for the colander, the Spätzle, you want to make this the consistency of kind of like gooey cheese. So it'll still be kind of sticky.
Can you show us what it's looking like in the bowl?
So it's pretty solid still. You have to really, after you get the right amount of water, you then have to beat pretty vigorously to get air bubbles in it. So this is definitely way too tight still. So I'm gonna add some more water.
So you're not adding the egg, you're adding water, right?
No, the egg was the first thing in the bowl. So it was just the eggs beaten at first. So they're already in there.
But you don't want to add too many eggs, I guess.
The egg is predetermined. You do, for the recipe, the whole recipe, it's 4. I'm doing half the recipe, so it's 2 eggs. Yeah, so now this is getting like more in the right ballpark. I always find I end up adding more, like more towards the higher end of the water. Like I said, but also sometimes it depends on the flour mixture you use. You might have to add a little more. So you really have to do it kind of to consistency. So now you can see this is sort of like, it's still pretty thick, but there's some goopiness to it. So once it gets to this state, you really are gonna, now you have to really get some air in there. So you're gonna use the wooden spoon and kind of just beat it until you get those little bubbles. Like you see the dough sort of bubble over. That makes sense. Little air pockets form. Get my workout.
I know, it does look like you're getting a workout.
Well, like I said, you know, it's pretty sticky. So if you don't whip enough air into it, it can be really hard to sort of get it. So I usually kind of stir it until it forms a little bit more of a consolidated clump, kind of scrape it off the sides. Because next is the fun part. So you have boiling water. And now we get to use the Spätzle roble.
I'm excited to see this.
So this just goes on the pot. And so we're gonna put the dough in here. And if you do the whole recipe, you will have to fill this multiple times. It won't all fit in at once. Turn this off. Boiling. Really just slide this back and forth. And it's just dropping little nuggets in. As you move it back and forth, it sort of cuts them. You can kind of see them coming down now. And then these usually take about 1 to 2 minutes. They'll float to the top when they're done. So the ones I did first are already floating. And then, yeah, the main thing is trying to use up all the dough. Like I said, it's pretty sticky, so you got to kind of scrape it out. But these things work pretty good. They're pretty forgiving. It really just depends on what consistency you want the end dumpling. You know, it'll get the job done no matter what. It's just I like them like more like a dumpling, but still have some of that like fluffiness to them. So if you like that texture, you definitely want to whip them longer. If you want them a little more dense, then you don't have to bother whipping them as long. So these are almost all risen to the top. You can see them. And then I'm gonna strain them because they're pretty much done. Just so you guys can see them. So then we have our little spätzle. And that's 99% of the entire recipe is making the spätzle. So now you have, like I said, there's sort of two options. You can assemble them to bake them like I did here. So this is just, I put a little bit of spätzle and then a little bit of cheese, you know, just sort of layering it. And then I would bake this for probably about 10 minutes until it gets nice and bubbly. And then you top, what I didn't mention at the beginning is that throughout this whole process, you can be caramelizing onions, because the traditional dish is really just the cheese, the spätzle, the homemade spätzle, and then it's topped with caramelized onions, usually really crunchy ones. So I already did that because that takes an hour. And so these will go on top. You know, you get the nice little crispy garnish. Usually you do that after you take them out of the oven. And the cheese is also the most important part of this dish. Like I said, you're gonna use these, the Alpine cheeses. So if you can't find Bergkäse, and even though it is a German dish, you could use Gruyere, Comté. I like to use a mix of a younger one and a more aged one. The younger one will give a really nice like pool. This is the same thing I say with fondue, because it's really the same hack there. And then the more mature cheese will give you more flavor. So you it's good to use a mix of the two. I usually go half and half, but that being said, if you don't need it or want it super cheesy and you'd rather just have like really great intense cheese flavor, then you could use an all aged cheese, or vice versa. If you want it more like gooey cheesy, but a little more mild in flavor, then you could just use the younger one. So cheese is sort of to taste. I have an amount in the recipe. Some people might think it's a lot, but I think it's the appropriate. It's a pretty cheesy dish when you have it there. I've seen American recipes of it, and the cheese is like a quarter of what this is adapted from a recipe from an Austrian cookbook that's in Austrian. And then I've supplemented some tips from The Guardian that has always does like a really good deep dive on some classic dishes. But it's really simple. And again, you can kind of make it your own. You don't have to use the onions, but that is the traditional dish from the Allgäu, the German part of the Alps, or the Bregenzerwald, the Austrian part of the Alps. That's like the very specific sub-region that this particular recipe is from, and the cheeses. But again, you can make it with any of your favorite Alpine cheeses. So you could even use non-Alpine if you wanted, but it seems like a little outside of the spirit of the dish.
No, it definitely sounds like going authentic is what's going to make it amazing. So,
yeah.
So, any questions?
Is it grated cheese? How
yeah, so I grated the cheese just like you would for a gratin or anything where you're layering it and then baking it. But like I said, if you do it while right now when the spätzle is hot, a lot of people just toss it with the hot spätzle and they don't even bake it. So that gives you like that gooey cheesiness, but you don't get the brown bubbly crust. So it really just depends on, you know, kind of thinking of your mac and cheese. Sometimes you have the gooey ones that are made with more of the sauce on the stove. And then you have the baked ones, which have the crispy top, which are a little drier. That's really the main difference with this dish too, and how you finish it. And I've had it both ways. There, more traditionally, they would toss it just with the hot spätzle and serve it that way. But I have had it at a couple restaurants there where they do finish it with like, you know, sort of in the oven to get that little layer on the top. So kind of just depends on what you prefer. I like the crunchy layers, so I usually go that way myself, even though it's less traditional.
I'm a fan of that as well. So
my favorite part.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lydia. And again, this recipe is going to be sent out with tomorrow's email. And tomorrow we have Sruthi Swaminathan doing an Instant Pot vegetarian chili with a chipotle crema. So definitely anyone who's looking for recipes for their Instant Pot and looking for weeknight dinners and things, join us tomorrow at 4:30, and I will see you all then. Thank you again, Lydia.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Bye. Have a great evening, everyone.